In this video, you'll learn to convert between fractions, decimals, and percents. We're going to take a look first at converting between fractions and decimals. Let's say we have a fraction, 2/5, and we want to write this fraction as a decimal. Well, remember that every fraction is in fact a division problem, and I can read this fraction 2/5 as 2 divided by 5. So to write this fraction as a decimal, that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to take 2 and divide it by 5. So we would say 2 is going to get divided by 5. Now, 5 is not going to go into 2 since it's smaller, so what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to add a decimal, and we'll add some zeros here. Bring my decimal straight up, and then I would say 5 doesn't go into 2, it will go into 2 0 times. 5 will go into 20, however, 4 times. 4 times 5 is 20. We subtract. We get 0 as a remainder, so when I write 2/5 as a decimal, I get the decimal 4/10. Any fraction can be converted into a decimal just by doing the division that's there in the fraction. Now let's take a look at converting a decimal into a fraction. Every decimal can be easily converted into a fraction by simply just reading the decimal. Now, when I say reading the decimal, I don't want to read this decimal as 0.18. That's not going to help us. But if I actually say the value of this number, that value, or the way I say those words, is going to convert directly to a fraction. So if I read this number as 1800ths, you can see how we could easily write 1800ths as a fraction. So I would write this as 18 over 100. Now all I have to do is simplify this fraction 1800ths. To do that, I would factor the numerator. With 18, I'm thinking 2 times 9. 2 is prime. However, 9 is not, so I would factor that into 3 times 3. 100, I'm thinking 4 times 25. 4, when I factor that, is 2 times 2. And 25, when I factor that, is 5 times 5. Let's take a look here and see if we have any common factors. Looks like just one common factor of 2 that I would divide out of both the numerator and denominator. So let's see. In the numerator, I'll have 3 times 3, which is 9. In the denominator, 2 times 5 is 10. Times 5 again is 50. So when I convert the decimal 1800ths into a fraction, I get the fraction 950. Okay, now let's talk about converting between percents and fractions and percents and decimals. To convert between percents and decimals, or percents and fractions, we're actually going to multiply by 2 simple fractions. The first fraction we're going to use when we're starting with a fraction or a decimal and we want to convert that fraction or a decimal to a percent. Then we're going to multiply by this fraction 100% over 1. Well, 100% and 1 are equal in value, so that's why I have this big fat 1 around these things. Because if I multiply by this, I'm going to be multiplying by 1, and when we multiply by 1, we're not going to change the value of the original thing we had. So again, to convert from a fraction or decimal to a percent, we multiply by this fraction. Now, if we want to convert a percent to a fraction or decimal, we're going to multiply by just the reciprocal of this fraction, which is 1 over 100%. So anytime we're starting with a percent and we want to convert it to a decimal or a fraction, we're going to use this 1 over 100%, which is also equal to 1. Let's take a look at an example now, converting a percent to a decimal. So we're starting with 16% here. We want to convert this to a decimal. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to write that 16% as a fraction. Anytime I want to write a whole number as a fraction, I'm just going to write it over 1. So I have 16% over 1. What I want to do now is I want to multiply by another fraction that is going to divide out this percent symbol. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose that fraction 1 over 100%. And you can see right away that those percent symbols are going to divide out, just like common factors do in fractions. So we're dividing that percent symbol out, we're dividing that percent symbol out. And when I multiply across here, I'm going to get 16 over 100. 16 over 100, well, we've already seen that, that's 1600ths. Another way of thinking about this is dividing by 100 is going to move the decimal place in 16 2 places to the left. That starts over here on the right, and we move it 2 places to the left. That's going to give me 0.16. Okay, now let's take a look at an example where we're converting a percent to a fraction. We're starting with this percent, 22%. Again, I'm going to write that over 1. We want to multiply now, again, to divide out that percent symbol. So I'm going to choose the fraction 1 over 100%. Percent symbols are dividing out. When I multiply these two fractions together, in the numerator I'm going to get 22. The denominator, I'm going to get 100. So I get the fraction 22 hundredths. Now I just need to simplify that fraction. Well, it looks like a common factor of 2 is in both the numerator and the denominator. So I can divide that common factor of 2 out, and I'm left with 11 over 50, or 11/50ths. Now let's take a look at converting a fraction to a percent. So I'm starting with the fraction 3/20ths. I want to end up, when I'm done with this conversion, to have a percent. So I'm going to multiply by the fraction 100% over 1. What this is going to do is it's going to introduce the percent symbol for me, which guarantees then that I'm going to have a percent symbol in my answer, which is where I'm going. I want to have a percent when I get done here. So let's take a look. I'm going to multiply these two fractions together, and I'm going to end up with a percent. Well, first thing I'm going to do when I multiply these things together is factor. And so across the top I'm going to have 3. 100, I'm thinking 4 times 25. 4 is 2 times 2. 25 is 5 times 5. In the denominator, 20, I'm thinking 4 times 5. 4 is 2 times 2. 5 is prime. Let's take a look at some common factors that I have here, and I don't want to forget my percent symbol that I have. So common factor of 5, and then 2 common factors of 2. It looks like then I'm going to get 15 over 1, which then is just 15%. Now let's take a look at converting a decimal to a percent. So I'm starting with the decimal number 62.5. Okay, I'm going to write that over 1, just like all these other problems. We start by writing it over 1. Now what I want to do is I want to introduce the percent symbol. So I'm going to multiply by 100% over 1. Now let's take a look. In the denominators here, I'm going to end up with 1. Carry my percent symbol over. Now multiplying by 100, all that's going to do is move my decimal place. And in this case, multiplying by 100 is going to move my decimal place 2 places to the right. So if I move this decimal 2 places to the right, I'm going to end up with 6,250. And so that is 6,250% when I convert the number 62.5 into a percent. To recap now on converting a fraction or a decimal to a percent, and also converting a percent to a fraction or decimal, we're simply going to multiply by one of these forms of 1. The first is 100% over 1, and then we're going to flip that and use 1 over 100%. Now to convert a fraction or decimal to a percent, we don't have a percent symbol here, so we want to introduce that percent symbol. So we're going to multiply by 100% over 1. If we start with a percent and we're converting it to fraction or decimal, we want this percent symbol to divide out. So we are going to multiply by 1 over 100%, and then from there, if we want a fraction, we'll write it as a fraction, or from there, if we want to write it as a decimal, we would write it as a decimal.